Okay, I'm almost ready to start reassembling this printer mechanism. Just one job left before I start, and that is to repair or straighten out these finger plates. As the rubber roller swells and these sort of kind of run along the bottom edge of the roller, they've got a tendency to be pushed out, and I think someone here is trying to bend them back in as signs of kind of gouging and scratching on the back of them. So it results in them all being bent, so you can possibly see they're all kind of bent out of shape. The other one's even worse. So I'm going to start by just straightening these out. The plate should be flat, and it's got quite a pronounced bend to it, and as I say, all the fingers are out of line. So I'll just get this sorted out, I'll straighten the other one, and then we can start reassembling this printer. Okay, I've straightened these out, realigned all the fingers so they're now all in a straight line. Done the same with both of these, and so we can now start to reassemble the printer itself. So with this, it doesn't really matter to a large extent what order you reassemble this. Obviously some things need to be put in first, otherwise you won't be able to put them in once you put rolls and that sort of thing in. You need to get the springs on first, but in terms of which order you put the rollers in, it's not that important, and it kind of builds itself as you go along. So what we'll do is we'll start off by reassembling the sub-assemblies, and we have got our replacement spring, so I've adjusted the length of this, made sure there are no burrs on the end, and that's ready to be fitted. The first thing I want to do is to refit the insert into the main chassis. This is an insert that unscrewed itself when I disassembled the unit. So it's just simply a case of putting a bit of Loctite, and we'll screw this back in. Okay, so I've put the insert onto a screw. All I need to do now is put a small drop of Loctite onto the insert. Wearing gloves again here, at least on one hand, to try and keep the parts as clean as I can. And now all we need to do is screw this in until the outer face is flush with the chassis, which is there. If I try and unscrew this, then the insert's just going to come back out, so we'll give it 3 or 4 minutes to set up. I can then take the screw out, and that's ready to go. In the meantime, the next step is to reassemble the advance plate. I mentioned when I took this apart that the bearing seemed very poor. It was a very rough, very chalky, and I thought I might have to replace that, but I flushed it out, left it soaking in some IPA overnight, blew it out with some compressed air. I did that a few times, and then I've very lightly oiled it, and it's come up very nice. It now feels very smooth and free running. With regard to lubrication, I noticed when I took this apart there was the remnants of grease on a lot of parts. On this there was signs of someone having greased it, and the same with other parts. This mostly runs dry. Very few parts of this need lubrication, and it's designed that way. You've got very hard plastic running on polished rails, and they do not need lubrication. If you lubricate them, they'll just pick up dirt and grime and grit, and it will basically grind away the plastic parts. The only parts that really need lubrication are where you have maybe a brass bush or a bronze bush in a roller. They're the only points that need to be lubricated. When I took this apart, I couldn't turn the shafts inside these. They'd all kind of gummed up, and just the grease and oil that had been used had dried up over the years, and that's what you get through the rest of the mechanism if you over lubricate them. So there's only a few points on this mechanism that need lubrication. One's in the main paper feed roller, and the other one are the main bearings in the guide roller. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to do is reassemble this advance plate, and it's very easy. We just take the twisted bar that pops into the bearing, and then we just fit the screw. Doesn't need to be horrendously tight, and if we've done this right, then this should now spin nice and freely, and that horrible kind of grinding feeling has now completely gone. It feels nice and smooth, and this turns nice and freely without any binding. Okay, so this spiral bar runs in a slot in the printhead carrier, and what this is for is it's what advances the paper each time the printer prints a row of characters. So when the printhead moves across, it rotates this spiral bar, and that in turn rotates the gear on the end. This gear meshes with the sprag clutch that's used to drive the rubber roller. So each time it prints a row of characters, it causes the paper to advance one row, and that's what feeds the paper out. It can of course feed paper without printing. And then a secondary function of the carrier. Notice you've got this spiral spring here. The printhead carrier itself sits on top of this, and it pivots on this center bar, and underneath this center bar you've got this guide, and this guide vane sits in the groove in the advance roller, the guide roller, and as it moves across it rotates, and as it rotates it causes the head to raise and lower from the paper. So we'll look at this in more detail later, but just bear in mind that as you assemble this, if you kind of figure out how it's supposed to work first, then it kind of makes the assembly far more straightforward and far more logical. Okay, the next thing I want to do is reassemble this, or at least as far as we can. So this is the shaft out of it. Notice there is significant wear on the end of this. I did contemplate, and I may make a replacement for this. It is quite badly worn, at least on one end. And then you also have the washer. There are two washers at each end. You've got a Viton washer and a steel washer, and this is meant to serve as kind of a buffer, so it stops a metal to metal contact at each end, and it allows the unit to run much more quietly, much more smoothly. So what we have to do with this is I'll lubricate this, and then this will fit inside here. The clutch, so the solenoid sits on this end, and it causes this slide to move. I have removed this. There's a circlip in here, so I've taken this off and cleaned it to make sure it moves properly. But what this does is the carrier, the guide that's on the back of this, sits in this groove, and in this position, when this rotates, nothing happens. It will just, the head will stay where it is. But if the solenoid is energized, it pulls this across, and then it acts like railway points, and instead of the guide just going round the outside loop, it is diverted onto the other rails, other tracks so to speak, and then it starts following this groove, and that's what performs a print cycle. So we'll look at that again in more detail once we have the mechanism partly assembled. So what I'm going to do now is just assemble this and get it lubricated, and then we'll move on to the next step. That's refitted into the guide roller. It rotates nice and freely, it's nice and smooth. I put a very small amount of lubricant on this, just light oil, and made sure that nothing's dripping out or leaking. I don't want oil everywhere. Next thing we can do is start to refit the right hand side cheek. So this has had a few minutes to set up, so I should now be able to unscrew this without the insert coming out. So the next thing we want to do is to fit the right hand side cheek. So that's this one, and basically this goes on, bolts on like this. Hopefully you can see what I'm doing, and at the same time I want to fit the mount, so the whole thing sits on a compliant mount, and then this bar goes through these two rubber bushes, through the bottom two holes in the chassis, and then the whole thing is free to move around slightly. So let's clear a bit of this out of the way and we'll get this side cheek put back on. Okay, so this just bolts onto the side of the chassis. So this sits in like this. We pass this bar with a threaded end towards the right hand side cheek through this, making sure we've got it the right way round. We need the earth wire at the right hand side, and then as we pass this through, we also pass it through the chassis. I'm to work around the camera here so you can see more than I can. Through the second bush, and then that's how the entire mechanism mounts on the bottom of the printer. What we can now do is fit the right hand side cheek, so that goes on through the bottom hole in the side cheek, and now we can use this plate. The bottom screw goes onto the rod we've just fitted, and the middle screw goes through the ground tag and into the bush that we replaced. So I'll just get that screwed into position. Okay, so I fitted this top bar temporarily just to make sure that this side plate is going to tighten into the correct position. I'll take it back out again in a minute once I've tightened the screws. And now I can tighten the screws. Again, they don't need to be horrendously tight. So we've got the centre one that screws into the insert that we fitted in the chassis, and then the bottom one is screwed into the end of the bottom mounting rod, and that gives us this compliant mount at the bottom of the machine. The side cheek's now held in place. I can remove this, get it out of the way for a few seconds. As I say, I just fitted this to make sure that this side plate was properly aligned. Okay, and now we can start rebuilding this from the bottom up. It doesn't really matter what order you refit these in, but I find it easier to start by refitting this one. So I've put the Viton ring and the steel washer back in, and we can now pass this into the solenoid and then fit the outer screw which comes through the right hand side plate. So I'll just get that refitted. So once you get the bolt started, you need to make sure that the Viton washer and the steel washer are not trapped either in this groove or between the solenoid and the shaft. And it should now be possible to pull the shaft the rest of the way in, but you need to make sure the shaft aligns with the hole in the side cheek. The narrow section on the shaft goes into the hole that the bolt passes through, and so the easiest way to do this is leave the bolt slack and then just move it around. And we should be able to find where it passes into the side cheek. There we go. We can now tighten the screw. Now if you don't do that, when you try to assemble the left hand side, you're going to damage something because it won't be possible to get the parts to fit in here properly. So I'm just making sure that the wires here are not trapped anywhere. There is a little groove for them to pass through, so I just need to rotate that slightly, and they're now in the right place. So tighten the screw, and we can now again check that the washers are in the right place, and we can slide this all the way on. Okay, now it looks like there's a gap at the end of this, but of course that's because there needs to be space for this to pull across when the solenoid energizes. So what we're going to do now is just check the solenoid to make sure that it works. I have tested it in terms of its resistance, but what we'll do is we'll just connect it to the bench supply so you can see how it actually moves. I've got the solenoid hooked up to the bench supply, and I'll try energizing this, and we should see the right hand section of the roller move across to the right. You can see each time I switch on the supply, that moves across. Okay, so that's working fine. What we can do now is move on and start fitting the rest of the parts. So this is the paper guide chute, and it sits on a rod that passes through. That's the rod we temporarily fitted, and this just hooks over the top, but it also supports the fingers, and it also connects to the ground return tabs. So we need to put all these parts together. So the way these are fitted, we've got these inserts on the back. It fits this way around, and the ground tabs go on first, so they fit on like this, and then the fingers fit on with the fingers kind of pointing upwards, and then they just fit over like this, and then the bottom plate screws into place. So I'll get that put back together, and then we can refit this part of the machine back onto the chassis. And it gets a bit fiddly from here because you need to kind of put several things in place at the same time, but it's not too bad because they are screwed to this right hand cheek, so they do tend to self-support once you get them in place. You just need to make sure you get them properly reassembled and get the wires to pass through the right place. If you get the wires on the wrong side of any of the rollers, there is a chance they could rub on the rollers, and obviously that would damage them when you try and run the printer. Okay, I now have this reassembled, and as you can see, the fingers are all nicely lined up. I did put the tabs back in, and I left there's an adjuster here that adjusts the relative position of this, and it pushes against the chassis, and what it does is it effectively sets the pressure of these fingers on the paper and roller. We'll may need to adjust that later. I've obviously put a new roller in here, so we'll look at that later on. But just bear in mind that adjuster's there, and it might need adjusting if you've replaced the roller. The pressure of these is fairly important. If they're pushing too hard on the paper, it can tear it. If they're not touching the paper, then the printer just won't work. So this whole thing rocks on a shaft, which we can now fit. So this is the one we fitted temporarily, and we put the threaded end towards the right hand mounting plate. So it just goes on through here, passes through the slot in this. Okay, and we can now fit a fixing screw and hold that in place. So as I said, if you push down on this, you can rotate it so far, then it will stop. And that is of course how it's adjusted. So if you screw this adjuster in, it will raise the fingers. If you screw it out, it will lower them, and they press on the underside of the rubber roller. And that's the part we're going to look at fitting next. Okay, so this is our roller, and this sits in this position, and I can tell already that we are going to need to back that adjuster out. It's pushing up too hard on the roller, so I'm just going to unscrew that adjuster slightly, and we'll bring it back up into proper adjustment later. I'm just going to take it quite a long way out of the way at the moment, just to give us a bit of room to work with. So just using an Allen wrench, I'm just going to screw this out slightly. As I screw this out, this moves down. You can kind of see it moving down as I unscrew the adjuster. Okay, and that will give us now far more room to refit the roller without it pressing too hard. So now we can line up the various parts. So what we have to fit on here to start with, of course, is the spacer. So we have the shaft that goes on here. There's a spacer. And a washer. So that's the thrust washer that sits between the main roller and this spacer. And then of course we have our newly manufactured spring. So we'll get this put back together. I'm just going to lubricate this as I did with the advanced roller, and just very slightly oil this. It's not in too bad a condition, there's a bit of scoring, but it's come up quite nice and clean. So I'll get this put back together. Okay, so that's the shaft fitted and lubricated. I've got the thrust washer fitted in between. And again, make sure that as you fit this, the washer doesn't drop down into the narrower section of the shaft. And we then have to fit our sprag clutch spring. Okay, so that's our spring in place, and what we can now do is bolt this onto the side cheek. And as with the lower roller, the narrow section of the shaft must fit into this hole on the side cheek. If it doesn't align properly, then this isn't going to rotate properly and it's going to bind up. So all we need to do is put it in, make sure this goes into the hole. Okay, so that's now passed into this hole, and I can refit the securing screw. And that will hold it all together and stop that thrust washer from dropping out of place. And if we've done this right, what we should find is that the roller will now only turn in one direction. So if I try and turn it this way, it locks up. If I turn it the other way, it rotates nice and freely. So that's exactly how it's supposed to work. We then have the clutch that goes on the other side of the roller. Now if we've done this right, then if we rock this back and forth, the roller should advance forward. That's the front face of it, should come up each time we operate the gear. I'm just going to zoom you in a bit so you can see a bit more clearly, and hopefully you'll be able to see it rotating. So I don't know how clearly this will come out on the camera, but we now have the two clutches fitted and they work together. So if each time I turn this, the roller comes up. Hopefully you can see it turning, and then when I go back the other way, the roller should not go back at all. And this is the point of this, is it's very fine resolution. It doesn't allow, it's not like a ratchet that moves back a certain distance till it hits the pole. This locks up straight away. So each time I turn this, it doesn't matter how far I go, then it works fine, and the roller is advancing in whatever increments I want it to. So that's working absolutely fine. Okay, good. And this works, of course, in conjunction with the gear on here. So each time this rocks, it causes this to rock, and it advances the paper, which is caught between the fingers on this bottom plate and the actual paper. Okay, so the next thing we can do is fit the two front support rails. So we've got one that acts as a stop, so this 5-ton O-ring here acts as an end stop for the print head. And the second rail is just a guide, so it just keeps the head properly aligned. And then these just fit into the holes that are in these side cheeks. There's no real screws that hold this in place, they're just kind of captive between the two end cheeks. Okay, now when I took this apart, one of the spring washers was at the right hand side of the shaft, but they should both be at the left hand side. So make sure they're not fitted. Again, this does not need lubrication. It's designed to run dry. As long as the shaft is clean and it's not scored, then it's fine. You just need to make sure when you fit this that this guide goes into the groove. Okay, so we'll now fit this to the side cheek, we just need to make sure this little tab goes into the advance roller as we fit it. So it goes in the one that passes through the head goes in the top position, goes into this hole here, and then as we put this in place, the tab should fit into this end groove. So you probably won't be able to see very well what I'm doing here. I'm just trying to make sure it's on camera as best as I can. But what it's doing is going down, and it should drop into position, which it has done. And you can't see it now because it's actually inside the groove, but that little tab is now in the groove on the roller. This second one comes through this guide hole on the, or guide slot on the head, and goes into the other hole that's on the right hand end cheek. So they're now fitted. So you can't move the head, of course, because it's now captive in this slot. But what we can now do is fit the remaining screws. I'm not going to fit the belt at the moment for two reasons. Firstly, I want to be able to drive this by hand to make sure it's working properly, but secondly, I don't yet have a replacement belt. I've got some on order, but they're not here yet. So there's one of these little spring washers goes on the bottom two shafts, and then we have a Viton O-ring and a steel washer that goes on each of the two main shafts, one for the rubber roller shaft and one for the advance roller. So as soon as you fit those, you can put the end cheek on, and when we fit this, we need to make sure that it's properly aligned with the print head. Now the print head is in its home position, so we just need to make sure that the end of this tab fits into that slot that's at the back of the print head that I showed earlier, and then this can be slid onto the assembly and the screw put in to hold it in place. So that's the last part, and if I will need to take this off again at some point to fit the belt, but I don't need to dismantle the rest of the mechanism. Okay, so you're not going to be able to see this very well, but I've got the two spring washers on the two guide spacer rods, and I've got the Viton and steel washer on the two main drive rollers. The next thing I have to do is guide this onto the printer and make sure that the slot at the end properly engages with the slot that's on the print head. You can't see it, in fact I can't really see it either, but it's down there somewhere, and it's just really a case of getting this rotated into the correct orientation, and then we should be able to get it to go into the slot. So it's now engaged in that slot, and I can now just wiggle around the end plate until all the shafts align, and it will then drop into place. So if you bear with me, I'll try and get this done. Okay, so it's part of the way on. What I have to do now is to, before these gears mesh up, is make sure I have this rotated into the correct position. As this moves across, it's going to cause the bottom gear to rotate in a clockwise direction, looking from the right hand side, and that's what advances the actual paper. So I need to make sure that this gear is properly meshed so that when this turns, it's not going to kind of run off the end of this gear. You can see at the moment that if it tries to turn, you can possibly see that it will run off the gear. So I need to rotate this gear and get it to mesh at the other end of its travel, so that when this rotates, it's not going to cause these gears to become unmeshed. So all I need to do to accomplish that is just to slightly separate these so that the gears will rotate independent of each other, and then rotate this gear into the correct position, and then push the end cheek all the way back on. Okay, well hopefully you can now see that the gears are meshed in such a way that as the advance rocker shaft rotates, it's going to rotate this, and it's going to cause the paper to advance. I'm going to leave the adjuster, which you probably can't see, but it's in there. This is the adjuster I backed off for the pressure of these fingers. I'm going to leave that backed all the way off for now, and or at least a long way off, and we'll adjust that once we get some paper fitted and make it so it's the right tension on the actual paper. Need to make sure everything's properly engaged. If it's not engaged properly and you try and rotate this, you'll damage something. It has gone all the way together, which is a good sign, so there's no slack. So that is now pretty much fully assembled. As I said, I will need to take the end cheek back off to fit a drive belt once I get one, but for now what I can do is rotate this manually and see if it will actually turn. Okay, I fitted the securing screw to the left hand side cheek to stop it falling off, but that's the mechanism now pretty much fully assembled. It doesn't have the drive belt on, of course, and it doesn't have the actual print head on. What I'm going to do is try rotating this by hand, and it's always best to do this before you start trying to drive it through the motor. It's a very powerful motor, it's got a lot of inertia, and if something does jam up, it's just going to smash it. So you need to do this fairly carefully. Now firstly, we need to make sure this is relatively stable. It shouldn't rock about and it shouldn't move side to side. If it moves too far side to side or rocks about, then something's not assembled correctly. The next thing to look at is, as this goes through a cycle, we need to make sure that these gears stay meshed. It doesn't really matter exactly where they are relative to each other, but it is important that they don't come out of mesh, otherwise the paper is not going to advance properly, or it could cause the mechanism to jam. If this rod jams, it will snap the tab off this carrier, which you really don't want. When you try rotating this, if it's put together correctly, it should rotate very freely. You'll feel a bit of drag as it starts to drive this across, but it should rotate quite nice and smoothly. So firstly, we'll try rotating it. It only turns one way. Don't try and turn it backwards, you will damage it. And so if we try and spin it, you can see it's spinning, or hopefully you can see it's spinning very nice and freely. It takes almost no force whatsoever to turn this. There shouldn't be any kind of side-to-side play in this, or very little, which is right. And if there is, then you've probably got a washer or something in the wrong place, so check that before you go any further. If it binds up, don't force it, don't try and turn it back the other way, you'll break something. If it binds up, you need to take the end cheek back off and free it up that way. So we'll turn it and it's fine. Now what I want to do is kind of trigger it into performing a complete print cycle. We know the solenoid works, so I could apply power to it, but I'm going to do this manually. So it triggers a cycle by pulling the solenoid in, so it pulls this plunger across while turning. So if I hold this across while turning, you'll see that before it completes a full cycle, the print head will start to move across, which is now done. So it's now engaged in this kind of zigzag portion of the track. If I continue to turn it, it should turn nice and freely. If it binds up or I get a lot of resistance, I need to stop turning it, something's not right, and it's now moving across. Several other things should be happening. It should be rotating this spiral bar, and also it should rotate this shaft here that the head would normally sit on. So we'll keep an eye on pretty much all of this as it goes, but the main thing is if it binds up, I need to stop turning it. So as I turn this, it's rotating this. Okay, so as we get towards the end of its travel, it's now got all the way across. It will reverse direction, but also this should rotate to reposition the print head. So you can see this is now rotating, and the print head is going back the other way. The two clutches have now swapped over. It's carried out the print cycle. It's now moving the print head back to the start position, but now the two clutches have swapped over. It's also advancing the rubber roller, which will advance the paper. So You probably can't see it, but the rubber roller is now turning. And it's now got back to its rest position, so you can carry on turning this as much as you want now, but the guide on the print head is in the end slot, the circular slot, so it'll just keep going round and round until another cycle is triggered. So we'll do it one more time. So I'll pull the solenoid across, and we've now entered the spiral part of the groove. It's moving across. This is where it would be printing, and with the head down, so you'll see this will rotate as we get to the end in reverse direction, and then the rubber roller will start to advance. So the rubber roller is now advancing. The head has been taken up off the paper and it's completed another cycle. So that's working fine. We're not getting much resistance on the roller, nothing's binding up, it's performing the functions in the correct order. I think we've still got too much tension on these, so I need to back these off yet further. Don't know why they were quite so far out, so I'll screw that back a little bit further. Okay, so now we've got very light pressure between the fingers and the rubber roller, which is how it should be, and if we need to, we can adjust that still further. We'll just temporarily fit this into position to make sure it does what it's supposed to. So that should fit down like that. You can't lift this with this tab down, so it locks it all into position, guides the paper, and then you can release this and this will lift up. So okay, that's all looking like it's working exactly the way it should. And that's the mechanism largely reassembled. So what I can do now is turn my attention to the actual printer itself, look at the electronics, start cleaning up the base, and we'll get back to this once a replacement belt has arrived. But as you can see, they're quite easy to assemble. Don't go mad with the lubricant, it doesn't need oil and grease everywhere, that will just make it fail after a while. But it has come up quite nice and clean, so that's looking like we might have this part of the machine sorted out. We still of course need to sort out the actual print head. Haven't decided what I'm going to do with that yet, but we'll get back to that in a future video.